I'm only going to touch on the decorative arts by implication. What I'm going to be doing largely is explaining why the term art is fundamentally dead and needs to be discarded. Now, I'm going to give you a diagnosis. I'm going to give you an explanation. I will not be very good at offering a solution. Historians are good with the past, rather bloody-minded with the present, and hopeless at the future. And you've really only got to read Niall Ferguson's column in the Sunday Times to realize all of those things. Let's start with a quick insight as to where we are at present. Tim has licensed what I'm going to do. He referred to a media event recently. I'll refer to one that's even more recent. It was in the Times on Tuesday, and it was a report. You may or may not have noticed, we're about to have a general election. Judging by the lack of queues in the council elections, which I managed to fit in en route here, it's going to be a very odd election. The oddest feature of it, perhaps, is the nomination by the Parliamentary Committee, Joint Parliamentary Committee on the Art Collection of Parliament, the nomination of their official artist to commemorate the 27 general election. Let me read her most interesting contribution so far, which led to her nomination. She is called Cornelia Parker. In 2010, Parker took green fluff from the House of Commons carpet and red fluff from the House of Lords carpet and projected them on a wall for her work, Political Abstract, Red and Green. And we are going to pay £17,000 more for that. The inanity, the absurdity, the sheer emptiness, vacuity echoing down corridors. It's not satire. It's not insight. Any meaning that it has at all depends upon the observer, who has to know that there are these two colours, which beyond the symbolism of the two Houses of Parliament have got no general meaning whatever. It is literally null and void. And this, I'm afraid, is not a one-off. Let us listen to this lady, I'm sure she would regard that as an insult, describing her present emotional state. I was working on this piece and trying to digest what's happened with Brexit and Trump, as we all are. It's very hard to make work in that kind of climate as you think, ooh, shit, there's a whole new world order. This is the level of insight that we are publicly financing. How have we got here? Why? We need to begin at the beginning. It's always, if you're a historian, a very useful place to start. The arts. The beginning of our civilization is, of course, as this building, this magnificent recreation as Hardwick in the 1830s, 20s and 30s saw it, of the interiors of an appropriate Roman building. Our culture begins with Greece and Rome. And the very notion of art and art is totally soaked in that world. I decided to do something which I hope is quite interesting, which was to look at one of the foundation documents of the transmission of that culture to the English-speaking world. It's the greatest Latin-English dictionary, Lewis and Short, of 1886. The entry on arts takes up the whole of one page. It is quite extraordinary. In other words, it is an encyclopedic essay. It is not simply a dictionary definition. It does two things. Paraphrasing, in the abstract of the Shorter Oxford English Dictionary, an art, ars artis, is skill as a result of knowledge and practice. These two things, the idea of knowledge resulting in practice. It is further defined by Lewis and Short as skill in joining something, combining, working, but also not simply as a material, but abstract notions, especially so far as it is known by external actions, as in the art of living. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, it is the fundamental human activity of interacting with our environment, our mental world, refashioning it and shaping it, but in accordance with, if you like, known doctrines, known techniques, known skills, which have traditions which may be handed down. So far, so very good. Cicero, you remember, with somebody who's going to crop up a lot, nothing that is human is alien from me. This is the central activity of being human. But ladies and gentlemen, there is a catch, and it is a very, very large catch. Last week, we seem to be being very autobiographical, Tim. Last week, I was lecturing in Bristol, and I was lecturing in the Colston Halls, which are, of course, the subject of exquisite anguish, the kind of anguish that the non-liberals of local government only can feel, that torture of needles of those who are even more self-righteous than they are, because Colston combined two deeply awkward characteristics. He was a uniquely generous benefactor of Bristol. There would be hardly any public property in Bristol if it hadn't have been for this man. Unfortunately, he got it all from the slave trade. So did Greece and Rome. So were Greece and Rome. The foundation of our culture is a slave culture. And the entire language of the arts to the present day, to this room, to what you do, to what is behind me, to how it is regarded, is conditioned by this fact. The Lewis and Short article goes on, and it analyzes and it points out that the Romans divided the arts into two. There are the arts of free men, the liberal arts. That's where the word comes from. It's free men as opposed to slaves. And these are essentially the literary arts of rhetoric, which are the appropriate, the oratory rhetoric, the analytical arts of logic and so on, the imaginative arts of poetry. These are the arts which are appropriate to a gentleman, and the arts of government, along with the useful superior arts like medicine and architecture. The rest, I'm afraid, are not the liberal arts. They are the sordid arts. They are the arts, the crafts of slaves. The key examples of these, let me give you them. One you'll all be quite happy about. We could entirely agree. It's totally sordid. The partitor, the boatman, the carrier, the kind of thug who hunks your luggage around in Venice and loses it, goes around with those, piles of vegetables and all the rest of it. So we're all quite happy about that, perfectly happy to describe the art, whatever it is, the job of the boatman, the carrier, as miserable, contemptible. The other example, and I'm quoting from Cicero's De Oratore, is the fenerator. Oh, gentlemen, ladies, who is he? He is the usurer and the capitalist in this temple of Mammon, in the heart of the city of London. The most sordid arts are the arts concerned with money and the making of money. Oh dear. I'm afraid it gets worse when we, from your point of view at any rate, when we shift over to Greece. Greece had a roughly similar division to this, but it had a particular hellhole, a pit, that's called Banausik. I'm sure many of you are much better at Greek than I am, but that, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, is a craftsman who works with fire, like a potter or a smith, or even a goldsmith. Now, I would suggest that these ideas are absolutely and fundamentally embedded in our culture, and they are particularly embedded in the culture of England. In fact, they come to it twice over, and they do so in a fashion which I am very familiar with in terms of my own background as a university teacher and as a historian. They come into our culture essentially in the 16th century. We are virtually unique in Europe in that the gentry and aristocratic political class, after the Reformation of the 1520s and 30s, moved en masse to educate their young in Oxford and Cambridge. And they educated them essentially in this set of ideas, in this notion. The greatest of those men, and the man who goes on to run the ship of state for virtually the whole of the reign of Elizabeth from the 1550s to the 1590s, is William Cecil, who spends the whole of his life with a copy of Cicero's De Officiis in his pockets, which is the text along with the De Oratore from which all of this stuff is taken. So this is the reason that our gentry absorbs so completely the set of values of the ancient world, which they adjust very, very inadequately to a non-servile culture. But of course, it's very easy to find equivalent groups. Who are the Banaustic in Shakespeare? Well, he even uses the word. The rude mechanicals, the standing of the mechanic, the failure of England to develop serious technical education is entirely soaked in this stuff. And then, ladies and gentlemen, of course, it's driven into us twice over, isn't it? Because in the 19th century, all of this is picked up yet again by the public schools. And you inculcate a doctrine of public service with an educational system which is based directly on the rhetorical texts of Cicero, designed to produce the administrators of empire with the identical values of that ancient world. And of course, it's accentuated even further by the fact that with university reform at the end of the 19th century, the dominant subject becomes Oxford greats, the Oxford classical tradition, in which virtually our entire political class, apart from those who went to Cambridge. Cambridge is the salvation. Cambridge is the salvation. I'm being deadly serious. Cambridge is the salvation. I'm a Cambridge man. But Cambridge is the salvation of 18th and 19th century England, because at Cambridge you could only take a degree in mathematics, which is why we are unique. But of course, mathematics is abstract. It's intellectual. It doesn't deal with sordid reality. But the fact that you have a Pitt or whatever who is actually taught mathematics, Pitt the Younger, is one of the reasons that we're actually able to do sordid things like balance the books, in complete contrast, for example, to the government of France. So we've got the then and now. We have then this double inculcation of this tradition. Now, I'm sure many of you will be squirming here very, very uneasily, but there were let-outs, of course, because thanks to Pliny and one or two others, it was perfectly acceptable. You'll be relieved to know there are people from the National Trust here and all the rest of it. It was entirely acceptable to make profit from land. So this wasn't sordid. So it was quite okay to do agricultural improvement, have canals, have coal, have slate, and have iron mines. B. Wentworth Woodhouse, do property development like the Dukes of Westminster and so on. That was all fine. It wasn't sordid. So we can all heave a sigh of relief and get on with the lecture. Right, so we're there. Now, what is the impact of this on what we regard as art? Because, of course, as you can see, to get from this to where we are now demands fundamental transformations of language. Art, in the sense that we use it, was unknown. Arts were very well known indeed. The liberal arts, as they became known in England in the 16th century, were the arts that were taught in the universities. So they were grammar, they were logic, they were rhetoric, there was geometry, there was arithmetic, there was astronomy, there was music. All of that was perfectly well known, but nothing that we would call the arts. We've got to go now to a separate tradition, and one that's grafted rather ingeniously on all of this. Can I just quickly sum up, though, what I've been saying now, because it's important, I think, that we get these big block ideas firmly understood. There is this distinction between the liberal and the sordid. Essentially, it's between the abstract, the ideas, the activities of the mind, they're liberal, and the sordid, which is anything to do with the hands, right? That's also defined by class, and it's also defined by status, which is why particularly the decorative arts, the arts of the fabricator, the thingy ones, even now, have got this problem. How then does our concept of art develop? Well, it does, to a significant extent, I think, by one very extraordinary man. And there are lots of people from the V&A here, so they will all know what I'm going to say now, and I apologize for repeating the obvious, but I'm just trying to fit this in. In many ways, the idea of art, as it's nowadays understood, is invented by one man. It's by Vasari, in what we call normally the lives of the artists. Except, of course, that's not what it was called. It was called the lives of the eminent painters, sculptors, and architects. The lives of the artists is a back formation. It's published in 1550. Vasari, as we all know, is a painter and an architect of some middling distinction, a Florentine, and he gives a series of linked biographies of the lives of the great painters of Italy in the very end of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. As far as we can tell, he actually invents the term, the Renaissance. He certainly invents the notion of the supremacy of the arts in the ancient Roman world and its rapid collapse, beginning with the age of Constantine. In fact, in that sense, he's really remarkably archaeological. He even gives, in the preface to the Lives, which is the fundamental text in all of this, he gives a jolly good description of the Arch of Constantine, how all the best bits were nicked from earlier arches, and the things that were contemporary are clumsy and crudely and badly carved. But what he's concerned to do is to elevate one art above all others, painting. He emphasizes the antiquity of painting. He does something else which I think is a very important clue to what I'm going to be talking about. He emphasizes that most painters are learned also in those abstract arts, because painting has got the terrible problem. It involves brushes. It involves pigments, canvas, wood, wet plaster. It's horrifyingly messy. Gentlemen aren't messy. So you've got to put in another little bit. They've got to be learned. They've got to be learned in these abstract arts as well. Their mere craftsmanship has got to be illuminated by the greater arts, the public arts, the liberal arts of philosophy and poetry. Now, Vasario's account is both remarkably good and remarkably bad. He makes extraordinary claims for the reputation of painting in the Roman period. Well, he would, wouldn't he? He's an Italian. These claims are entirely false. We know the names of no Roman painters. There is no evidence that any of them signed their works. The great bulk of them were slaves. They were decorators. We do, of course, know the names of Greek painters, Apelles. We know, and we have, a particular and splendid story quoted by the Roman historian, well, he's more of a sort of, all-purpose chronicler, Pliny, that Alexander was so impressed with the work of Apelles that he gave him his mistress. Talk about appreciation. Many of us would be the end. What is it? I'm told I'm getting a gift. What is it, Tim? You come at the end of this. So we've got then the model under the Greeks of Assyria, but not at all the Romans, of the social status and of the apparent appreciation by the rich and powerful of the artist. And what you can see from this point onwards, with the invention of the idea of the artist, these multiple biographies, though not yet the word, these multiple biographies, we get the invention of the idea of art, of its history, of a coherent aesthetic doctrine, of an art history, all of it one man. I mean, really, the views that individuals do invent things, which we tend to think of as being terribly primitive and un-Marxist, has got actually an awful lot of historical evidence for it. But there we are. In the same way, as far as we can see, Aristotle and Plato really do invent how we think. They really do. So, from this point onwards, there is very clear evidence in certain cultures and in certain places of a rapid elevation of the, if you like, the idea of the artist and his social standing in our modern sense. Let's try and stick to painter. The most famous story, of course, is the great story of Titian, the Venetian portrait painter, and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the effective ruler of Europe, a kind of complete EU in himself, though he had much better manners, as we can see from the little story. And the famous story is that while Titian is painting Charles's portrait, he drops a brush, and the emperor, out of courtesy, bends down to pick it up. Well, wouldn't it be nice? It is, in fact, very late. The evidence comes from 1648, almost a century after the emperor was dead, from the work of a notoriously gossipy Venetian, a man called Carlo Ridolfi. But what recent scholarship has done, and it's really rather interesting, and I didn't know this until I started looking at it, it has demonstrated that there were, in fact, genuinely intimate relations between Charles V and Titian, that Charles V gossips with him, confides his movements with him, tells him things that his own privy councillors don't know. Remarkable evidence. Interestingly enough, other figures who are outside the aristocratic class that are treated in this kind of fashion are, of course, doctors. There's a remarkable book by Hugh Trevor Roper on Theodore de Mayerne, who is the doctor of James I, which is a remarkable understanding of how somebody outside the formal political elite, and indeed a foreigner, can actually step into the arcana imperii. And we all know, again, that you get formal recognition in the 17th century, when, of course, Carlo Ridolfi is writing of the status of painters with knighthood. The first one is Peter Paul Rubens, Sir Peter Paul Rubens, though, of course, he's probably knighted primarily as a diplomat, but certainly his pupil, Sir Anthony van Dyck, is knighted as a painter. Now, we seem to be doing quite well. In England, all of this is pretty slow, despite Charles I, or perhaps because of Charles I. The very fact that Charles I had taken the arts of painting so seriously, I think probably set it back half a century when you consider the rest of the things that he actually did. And it's interesting to note how slow we are to adopt and adapt linguistically. The French have already set up an Académie des Beaux-Arts in 1648. English does not have the term fine art until the 1760s. The earliest use of the term artist to mean a painter is 1747. It's yesterday. Now, That brings us neatly to the moment at which painting steps fully onto the stage in England as an acknowledged, distinguished profession for which you can be a gentleman, that you can be regarded as an intellectual, that you can be a friend of royalty, that you can be altogether an okay person that you would have to dinner. And the key figure in all of this, of course, is the first president of the Royal Academy, president in 1768, just the moment you've got fine art into the language, who is Joshua Reynolds, knighted in 1769, and then, unfortunately, holding forth unstoppably on the subject of art from 1769 to 1790. And what he's got to say on it is very interesting, and please listen carefully. He is a man, of course, of the most modest background and no formal education. It's an astonishing career, which is the result of native talent, energy, self-invention, and relentless climbing of ladders and lobbying. He's great, very much like arts nowadays, but anyway, all of those things. Listen to what he says. He's constantly aware of the Banosic element. He's constantly aware of the inferiority of hands. All the time, he is claiming something more. Let's look at it. This is him on painting. What is painting? Not the industry of the hands, but of the mind. The painter stands in need of more knowledge than is to be picked off his palette. And then when he goes into the highest form of describing what the painter is in quest of, listen to it. It's wonderfully written, and it's in its sheer abstraction, it's rather remarkable. The beauty of which we are in quest is general and intellectual. It is an idea, this is Reynolds, it is an idea that subsists only in the mind. The sight never beheld it, nor has the hand expressed it. It is an idea residing in the breast of the artist, which he is always laboring to impart, and which he dies at the last without imparting, i.e. art is conceptual. This is Reynolds destined to be seen as the peer of Burke and Johnson. This is what it's really about, and firmly on the side of the liberal. Now, where does this fit with what's happened? Because, of course, what we're dealing with, a gentleman came up to me whilst we were both quaffing champagne beforehand and said, I hope you're going to tell me what conceptual art is. Well, I've already started. There is a clear element in the attempt of the social justification of the arts, which ignores the practical, the painterly, the getting your hands and your palette and your brush dirty, and lurks to a Platonic notion of idealism, that quest for something up there. What has happened when art becomes modern? When does it begin? What is it? How does it relate to what I've been talking about now? Because broadly speaking, what I'm going to say is that it seems to me that we have witnessed an extraordinary act of takeover founded essentially, and I'm not going to mince words, on lying and bad faith. I'm not going to dispute aesthetically. It seems to me to be pointless. I'm simply going to describe. Modern art begins in New York in 1917, as we all know, when a young French émigré, Marcel Duchamp, submitted a urinal signed R. Mutt and entitled Fountain to the Society of Independent Artists annual exhibition. The piece was rejected, but modern art was born. How do I know? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I decided on numbers. We live in a democratic age. And I was able to find out that in the run-up to the Turner Prize of 2004, a poll of 500 art experts was taken. You didn't know there were so many, did you? Imagine how you financed them. Imagine what they cost. Anyway, there were 500 of them. And they were asked to decide in the run-up to the Turner Prize which was the most important modern artwork of all. And this is the result. If only I could do it, with the appropriate cards, never mind. Third came Warhol's Marlin the diptych of Marilyn Monroe. Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon came second, whilst Duchamp's Fountain was the easy winner as the most influential modern artwork of all. And I think they are absolutely right. Now, I've used these words like lying, like bad faith, and I want now to take them back, at least about the Marcel Duchamp of 1917. Marcel Duchamp in 1917 was completely honest, open and frank about what he was doing. He's 30 years old, and he is as open and honest as any man of that age can be or tend to be. Or not, rather, not beliefs, but non-beliefs. Who is he? As I'm sure many of you know, he's a member of a loose-knit group of artists, writers, and intellectuals who call themselves Dada. Dada is a nonsense word for a group deliberately devoted to the subversion of reason and meaning in art, literature, and life. For according to the Dadaists, unreason is the only sane response. This is 1917. The only sane response to a world made mad by the unimaginable, unprecedented horrors of the First World War. So what Duchamp is about in 1917 is anti-art. He is completely, totally persuaded of the absolute absurdity and wickedness of the idea of art. He calls himself an anti-artist. Better still, he's very interested in language, using back formation from the word anarchist, he calls himself an artist, a not artist. Like everybody else in the group, he rejected comprehensively art and everything to do with it. He rejects the notion of aesthetics. He rejects the notion of institutions. He rejects the notion of achievement. He rejects the entire Vasari package and the whole package of academies and money and biographies and distinctions and knighthoods and everything else that was built on it. He proclaims from the rooftops there are no artists and there are no works of art. No one and nothing. What were called such have no value, and they have no monetary value in particular. One of his more famous sayings is, Rembrandt should be used as ironing boards. He's supposed to have declared, in my other saying. Now, can we get that idea clear? Duchamp and the rest of them are 1917, totally honest. They are anti. They are not an art movement. They're seeking to destroy the very idea of art and its entire intellectual and institutional framework. And indeed, this seems to me to be something generally we should understand with modernism. Most modernism is a deliberate attempt at destroying an anterior culture. That's what it's there for. That's what it was about. It's as destructive, if that's to say, as the First World War itself. Now, Duchamp's genius, and I use the word deliberately, I think Duchamp is a genius, is to translate these vaguely leftist verbal postures into a series of brilliant visual gestures or puns in which he invents anti-art. It's like antimatter. It's a concept that a physicist would understand. And as we all know, when matter and antimatter meet, there's a vast explosion and they both disappear. And that's what he's envisaging doing. Again, this is why I use the word pun. So many of them are puns. The urinal, of course, is by far the best. What is it? It is non-art by a non-artist. It's also by a non-person, because it's signed R. Mutt, who apparently is also a woman. It's mildly smutty. The Dadaists loved smut. The dirtier, the better. And it, again, of course, it's turned upside down, like the world, and with its elevated title of Fountain and its submission to an annual exhibition, it mocks perfectly the pretensions of those who thought they were artists and knew what art was. So totally honest, absolutely straightforward what it is. But of course, Duchamp, because he's a genius, doesn't limit himself to, this one thing, or to give it what later on becomes the term of art, objet trouvé, found object or ready-made. He also, and in an astonishingly short period of time, comes up with a whole series of other non-art forms. Listen to them. He creates kinetic, that is, moving sculptures. Some simple, like a mounted rotating bicycle wheel on a stool. Others of them are more elaborate, which produce optical illusions when spun at speed on the most available rotating thing, the turntable of a gramophone. Do you know what he called them? 1917, he called them mobiles, which, like so many of those gestures he toss off, stick. And then he shot films of them in motion. Then he used graffiti. He used graffiti to debunk and shock. He painted, most famously, a neat Poirot-style moustache and beard on a reproduction of the Mona Lisa, and he gave it a funny title, L-H-O-O-Q, or in French, Elle a chaud au cul. She's got a hot bottom, or she's got a, hot ass. I did mention the smut, you will forgive me. And he then continues with these heavily sexualized titles. One of the most weird mechanical creations is called The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even. It sounds better in French, but I've forgotten it. Anyway, so we've got mobiles, we've got lots of sex, we've got graffiti, we've got the use of film, we've got optical illusions, we've got, well, we haven't finished at all. He makes use of chance, falling bits of string in his various assemblages, or he produces mechanical devices to produce random musical happenings. This, of course, is when John Cage is in his cradle. And he dresses as a woman, shades of Grayson Perry, and has himself photographed as such by Man Ray, who's better than anybody, I think, that Grayson Perry's been photographed by. He's under the name of Sir Rose, or rather, Rose, E-R, Rose, c'est la vie, which again in French becomes Eros, c'est la vie, Eros, life. He even comes up, you've got it, with the term conceptual to describe all of this as opposed to the merely retinal or eye-pleasing. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, there is absolutely nothing that Cornelia Parker or anybody who's ever submitted anything for the Turner Prize that was not done between 1917 and 1922. It is derivative, it is lame, it is unoriginal, it is tedious, it is overrated, it is pointless. I mean, there it is. The evidence is absolutely crystal clear. Then there's something else which I enormously admire this man. Still in his 30s, he stops. He gave it all up, and he devoted almost the whole of the rest of his life to playing, studying, and writing about chess. Had he got bored? Was he overcome by the sheer pointless absurdity of constantly attacking something, art, which he professed to believe did not exist? Or, this is what I think is going on, worst of all, did he have intimations that his anti-art might transmogrify horror of horrors into a zombie, life-after-death version of art itself? We don't know, But once again, I think there's a sort of nobility, there's a kind of honesty in Duchamp's renunciation and self-exile into the world of chess. And what makes it even better, like Christ in the wilderness, he undergoes temptations, which Christ-like, well, not quite, he resists for a time. The first to play the role of the tempter is the director of the Knoedler Gallery in New York, who in the 1930s offered him a substantial sum if he would continue to produce the Cubist-like works for which then he was best known. That's things like The Bride Stripped Bare. Duchamp brushed the offer aside, declaring if only the artists of the Turner Prize would follow him in this regard at least, it would force me to repeat myself. I will not even envisage this shameful possibility. Duchamp also worried, as his ready-mades became better known after the Second World War, that they might succumb, oh God, to the aesthetics of patina and become venerated as art objects themselves. Perhaps he wondered, should he swap them for newer mass-produced objects and, for example, replace his bottle dryer with a plastic bucket? Think of the contents of the Tate if he had. Anyway, but the most interesting thing is what was put into his mouth by the people who followed after him, because the Dadaist movement slivers rather inelegantly into surrealism. And the surrealists really did regard themselves as artists. And what they try to do, they try to co-opt Duchamp to their art movement. Of course, Duchamp still playing chess, still saying there's no such thing as art, still saying I mustn't be covered with patina. It's still the whole thing is a disease. And the moment comes with André Breton and Paul Éluard in their Dictionary of Surrealism of 1938. And there's an entry there which describes famously, and it's the one you will see in every art dictionary as a definition of ready-made or objet trouvé, which is an ordinary object elevated to the dignity of a work of art by the mere choice of the artist. Again, virtually everything for the Turner Prize. It's signed MD, and it's a fake. We know it's actually by Breton himself. In other words, it's a lie. The very term, the very definition, which is constantly used, is actually a lie. So, he's surviving. He's virtuous. He's Christ-like. But then, of course, the 60s. And at the very beginning of the 60s, Duchamp is rediscovered. He's hailed as a cultural, or is it countercultural? The words mean nothing, so it doesn't matter. Icon, and he's recognized at this point as the grandfather of everything from pop art to the happening. Now, at first it seems that Duchamp is still going to resist. There's a remarkable exchange in 1961, of course, that I was living, 15-year-old, that mad tawdry decade's barely begun. One of the fellow surviving Dadaists writes to Duchamp, and because Duchamp tends to speak in these extraordinary little pilules of speech, his friends tended, and it's very difficult and it's very dangerous, they tend to put words into his mouth. So it's a very odd letter. He actually writes to him and says, look, come on, can't you say something like this? And listen really very carefully to what his friend says. He's describing the work of particularly the work of Jasper Johns and all this kind of thing in America. This neo-Dada, this is what he wants him to say. This neo-Dada, which they call new realism, pop art, assemblage, etc., is an easy way out. It lives on what Dada did. When we've got to imagine, Duchamp speaking, discovered the ready-mades, I thought to discourage aesthetics. In neo-Dada, they have taken my ready-mades and found aesthetic beauty in them. I threw the bottle rack and the urinal in their faces as a challenge, and now they admire them for their aesthetic beauty. They have stood me on my head. Every word, of course, is true. It's exactly what had happened. But he scribbles in the margin, oui, ça va bien, okay. Fine. But he never makes it public. At least it's a kind of gesture of dissent. But it's not loud and it's not clear. And then there comes the moment of the fall. And I think this is when modern art really begins. Sex began in 1967, didn't it? Well, it's 1964, the year I went to Cambridge. The two events are not connected. Earlier that year, the art dealer Arturo Schwarz mounted an exhibition entitled Omaggio a Marcel Duchamp in his gallery in Milan. The exhibition included reproductions of two of Duchamp's ready-mades, and Duchamp came to Milan for the opening. Now, what next happens is unclear, and it's in dispute. Schwarz claimed that it was Duchamp who took the initiative. Concerned that many of his ready-mades, including the fountain himself, had been lost, he suggested that Schwarz should make an edition of 13 of them. There's a little problem with this. Why, if Duchamp's concerned about the oblivion of his oeuvre? Well, it's also, how can you be concerned about the oblivion of your oeuvre when you don't believe in art and you don't believe in the entire structure of a work of art? If his concern were real, why then did the edition have to include works that had actually survived as well as those that were lost? Why, ladies and gentlemen, make 8 numbered copies of each one of them? Why sign every one of them with Duchamp's real name, thus reviving at a stroke, and I quote the young Duchamp, the fallacy of romanticizing the conscious individuality of the artist, which the young Duchamp had satirized and subverted with his female impersonation of Ce Rose, c'est la vie. I suppose we've to be truthful. Schwarz obviously was lying, and the idea of the edition was his from the beginning. But by listening to this new Mephistopheles and going along with his scheme, Duchamp has thrown away his integrity, which he guarded so long, and he's embraced bad faith. In his 70s, he's become what in youth he most despised. He's become an artist. And he's become an artist whose works are fake. Every single one of those things you see in the Tate or in MoMA is an industrially produced fake made in Milan in 1964. And there was a French magistrate stupid enough to say, when some was intelligent to use the urinal in the Pompidou Center for its proper purpose, that it was the equivalent of assaulting the statue of Michelangelo's David. And this thing is an industrially made fake. How can folly be so infinite and sit on the seat of justice? Now, how does he reconcile himself to this? Well, in 1967, with barely 16 months to live, and in what amounts to his valedictory interview, as he began it quite simply, "I am waiting for death," he was confronted with a paradox. How his interviewer, and it's a very remarkable interview, his interviewer asked, could he justify that his ready-mades had ended up being consumed in museums and exhibitions and sold as art objects? And why had he exacerbated the process by acquiescing in the multi-copy signed editions of the Galleria Schwarz? This is his reply. There is an absolute contradiction, Duchamp concedes, but that's what's enjoyable, isn't it? He added quickly, bringing in the idea of contradiction, something that we've never had before, never really been used, and the Blairite you see. It's shameless, in other words. By wriggling on his word, Duchamp is trying to have his cake and eat it. And it seems to me Duchamp has completed his fall. He's no longer merely a mercenary artist. He's become a fake and a purveyor of fakes, each numbered, signed, and priced as with the triple mark of the beast. Strikingly, the moral case against Duchamp turns on a word, contradiction, which takes us back to the beginning of Dada itself. For Dada wasn't only an attack on art, but on literature and language as well. Hugo Ball, in the first Dada manifesto of 1916, says as follows: I shall be reading poems that are meant to dispense with conventional language. I don't want words that other people have invented. I want my own stuff, a chance to get rid, and Goldsmiths listen, to all of that filth that clings to this accursed language, as if put there by stockbrokers' hands worn smooth by coins. Stirring stuff, even with the example given, Dada Tazara, Dada Madada, Dada Madada, Dada Mahum, is perhaps less than compelling. But there's a problem, which is tackled with undada-like economy by Lewis Carroll in Alice's encounter with Humpty Dumpty. For Humpty Dumpty too had a way with language. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I want it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master? That is all. If you play with language enough, non-art becomes art, and an artist becomes an artist, and with all the old pretensions, money and power. Which is to be master? That's all. In other words, changing language is about changing power. Each revolution, as George Orwell understood so clearly, tries to invent a new speak, to impose its own worldview. Neo-Dada, following as ever in the footsteps of Dada, has been extraordinarily successful in this endeavour. All discrimination and all concerns about petty things like contradiction have been washed away in a slew of nonsense words. Dada Turner Prize, Dada Madada Mama, Dada Pompidou, Dada Madada money. Because never has there been a more venal art than this stuff which proclaimed that it didn't want the filth of lucre upon its hands. Never has art been so calibrated to the exact measurement of purse, never been so much been displayed in the lobbies of international banks. Never in that formal Roman sense of sordid, the mercenary, the usurer, the capitalist, has it been so tainted. The paradox is infinite. But of course, there's nothing nonsensical about the result, which can now be seen every year in the pomp and circumstance of the Royal Academy dinner. It is a scene worthy of Orwell's savage pen. Indeed, it takes only the lightest alteration, and I refer you to the end of Animal Farm, that's the great dinner given by the farmers to the pigs, to make him describe it. The guest looked from young British artist to Royal Academician, and from Royal Academician to young British artist, and from young British artist to Royal Academician again. But already it was impossible to say which was which, and Tracy Eamon is Professor of Drawing. How Duchamp, at least the old rotten one, would have giggled appreciatively at the absolute contradiction. Ladies and gentlemen, which is why the word art is corrupt and is probably terminally so. I think we genuinely have reached a cultural cul-de-sac. Those claims of the Renaissance, those hopes, ambitions of Vasari and Reynolds have ended in, what to be blunt, is the wet fart of Cornelia Parker. It's finished. I think it's unrescuable, as I think so much of our culture is. You know, we do need to recognize things have ends as well as beginnings. And it seems to me we're at that point. Now, it may be, I said there'd be a very brief mention of the decorative arts. It may very well be the decorative arts where the element of craftsmanship, that difficulty of wrestling with the materials, the thing which the writer, the real writer, not the confecter of the absurdities of Dada or Cornelia Parker, actually has to do, that process of wrestling with your materials, that skill, the rules, the requirement of communication. It may be that all of those things are capable of rescuing it. But I think it will require a new approach and new words. Thank you.